Hello and welcome to yet another part of our series exploring the various facets of Russian foreign and domestic policies. As part of this, we talk to some of Russia's leading experts to understand better the interests and motivations of Russian policymakers on issues that have wide ranging implications for international politics. Today, we will focus on a topic that is never really far from the minds of key global decision makers, and that is the US Russia relationship. It is hardly necessary to impress upon anyone the critical nature of this bilateral engagement, given the high stakes involved for strategic stability and the world order. All these questions are once again in the spotlight with the election of a new president in the United States. So, to discuss all these recent developments and their implications for the US Russia engagement, we are joined by one of Russia's leading experts on the subject, Dr. Dmitri Suslov, who is the Deputy Director at the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies, National Research University, Higher School of Economics, Moscow. Dr. Suslov, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure for me.
While I would obviously want to dive right into the latest developments with the election of Joe Biden as the next US president, before we do that, could I ask you to give us a short assessment of the US Russia relationship in the past 4 years and where does it stand at the moment?
Well, the US-Russian relations are confrontational, and unfortunately, over the last 4 years, this confrontation deteriorated even more. There were some benign expectations in Russia concerning possible mitigating this confrontation with the arrival of Donald Trump 4 years ago, because of Trump's quite favorable rhetoric vis-a-vis Russia, and because of what seemed to be his realist instincts when it comes to foreign policy. He was skeptical about liberal international order. He was hostile towards American foreign policy interventionism, especially with the use of military force. He criticized Obama policies on some of those aspects on which Russia criticized Obama foreign policy as well. For instance, in the Middle East, Donald Trump did not consider Ukraine, for instance, and some other countries in the former USSR as important. And Donald Trump was supposed to conduct more unilateralist, more egoistic foreign policy, it was assumed that it would undermine American relations with many of the US allies, especially in Europe. So taking all that into account, Russia hoped for a little mitigation of relations with the United States. But some of these expectations actually came true. When it comes to the deepening of the crisis in transatlantic relations, indeed, Trump administration contributed to even more deepening of that crisis. But in terms of a more softer or less confrontational approach towards Russia, it turned out to be wrong. I mean, positive expectations turned out to be wrong, primarily because of internal problems in the United States. Not only, but the major decisive factor was the US domestic politics, and namely Russiagate, and the usage of Russia as a instrument of American domestic political struggle. Since Democrats used accusations of the collusion, which turned out to be false, but nevertheless, between Donald Trump and Kremlin, and in general, the issue of so-called Russian interference into the US elections in 2016, they used Russia factor as one of the major instruments, in one of the major weapons in their hands against Donald Trump. And that prevented any sort of engagement with Russia. That resulted not just in failure to improve relations, but it actually made any sort of dialogue with the United States impossible. or very difficult in the last 4 years. Another factor which also contributed to further deterioration of the U.S.-Russian relations is the difference between the traditional American foreign policy establishment, the so-called deep state, and the personal positions of Donald Trump. They didn't agree on many issues, including policy towards Russia. So the deep state made everything possible to, to limit Donald Trump in his Russia policy and to ensure continuity. Thus, many instruments were implemented in order to prevent any sort of improvement in the U.S.-Russian relations, such as, for instance, the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which made the majority of American sanctions against Russia impossible to be repealed in the observable future. There was also a China factor. One of the reasons why Trump from the very beginning wanted or speculated about improvement of relations with Russia was that he assumed to establish more cooperative relations with Russia against China, right? And he considered Russia as a possible participant of the anti-Chinese arrangement that was unacceptable for Russia. So Russia, made it very clear to the Trump administration, thus even political will on the side of the Trump administration to engage Russia decreased. So as a result of all those factors, actually the U.S.-Russian relations deteriorated even more. And more sanctions were imposed against Russia. And as I already said, the major problem is that these sanctions are almost impossible to be repealed in the observable future, since they are confirmed by the legislative decision, by the legislative act of the US Congress. Agenda of US-Russian relations almost disappeared, because it was politically dangerous for Trump administration simply to talk to Russia, simply to sit at the negotiation table. Any dialogue was immediately interpreted in the United States as a sort of a proof of Trump's collusion with Russia, or some risk that Trump would, make some concessions to Russia, and so on and so forth. Thus, strategic stability dialogue was very narrow. Russia and the United States during the Trump administration failed to negotiate about extension of the New START. Moreover, our expectations on the negative part of the Trump's foreign policy instincts and portfolio turned out to be right, namely unilateralism and disregard of arms control, skepticism towards arms control. Trump administration made a big negative contribution by unilateral withdrawals from the INF Treaty, from the Open Skies Treaty, the overall skepticism towards arms control. It made US-Russian relations not just worse, but even less manageable, and increased the risks of arms race and inadvertent military conflict. And diplomatic relations during the Trump administration also suffered. They became abnormal. There was a diplomatic war and visa war between Russia and the United States, in the course of which the sides closed several consulate generals in both countries, and the embassies in Washington, Russian embassy in Washington and American embassy in Moscow, look like fortresses, besieged fortresses, right? Which is an abnormal thing. It is worse than it was even in the times of the Cold War. So my resume, my conclusion was that as a result of these problems that we faced during the Trump administration period, US-Russian relations became not just confrontational, but also dysfunctional.
Okay, so now that we know where we stand, and as you say, US-Russia relations are almost dysfunctional at this stage, how do we see the incoming administration in this regard? Joe Biden is an old hand at foreign affairs. His nominee for the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, too, is a well-known figure. In fact, almost all of the announcements of the nominees that have been made till now, they're pretty experienced people who are well known to the policymaking community. So, based on their track record and worldview, how would you see these appointments informing the US-Russia relationship in the coming years?
Well, first, the expectations in Moscow about U.S.-Russian relations during Biden administration are very limited. So unlike 4 years ago, there are no positive expectations whatsoever about Biden administration. And in general, there is an anticipation for further deterioration of U.S.-Russian relations. The general trend will be that US-Russian relations will be getting even more confrontational in terms of political rhetoric, in terms of political atmosphere, in terms of some actions that the United States are likely to take vis-a-vis Russia in the coming years. You said that Biden and people like Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are well-known experts in international relations. This is true. And of course, Biden foreign policy is supposed to be more predictable in comparison with Trump's foreign policy. However, from the Russian perspective, this is largely a negative predictability. So we predict even further deterioration of relations with Russia. However, having said that, despite the overall deterioration of the US-Russian relations, we consider, or the prevailing opinion in Moscow is that some tangible results, in terms of tangible results, in terms of the almost, although narrow, but still agenda of US-Russian relations, the relations with the United States will be more resultative, more functional, than under Trump administration. And the reasons for this more functionability of US-Russian relations will be the following. First, the Russia factor in the United States, in American domestic politics, will not disappear at all, but will certainly be reduced in the next 4 years. A new Russia gate is unlikely. It is impossible to accuse Biden of collusion with Kremlin. He's very critical towards Kremlin and Russia. And there is, and probably there will be, no official accusations of Russian interference into this 2020 election in the United States. Thus, there will be less usage of Russia as an instrument of domestic political struggle in the United States, and there will be this will create preconditions for more engagement. It will be less risky, politically risky, for Biden administration to engage with Russia in comparison with Trump administration. Secondly, those people who are supposed to take and who will take the leading foreign policy positions in the Biden administration, Blinken, Sullivan, some other people, John Kerry, responsible for climate, in general, they are considered, although they are considered liberal interventionists, and they prefer the return of the United States to spread of democracy, regime change policy, and so on and so forth. They are not supportive of arms race, and they take arms control much more serious in comparison with the Biden administration. Thus, in terms of some positive, tangible achievements from the Russian perspective, it is possible first to extend the New START treaty with the Biden administration in the very first weeks when this administration comes. Secondly, it will be easier to engage in negotiations, in dialogue with the United States about post-New START, about what comes after New START, about the new architecture of arms control and strategic stability beyond this, what we consider to be last bilateral major US-Russian agreement on strategic nuclear arms. Third, since Russia will be used less as an instrument of American domestic political struggle, it will be easier to engage in cybersecurity dialogue with the Biden administration. This is very, very important issue because cybersecurity has already become a domain of warfare and has already become a part and parcel of strategic stability. So rules, at least some political understandings concerning rules, concerning the rules of military behavior in this area are essential. And this is what we should have done with the United States years ago. Now, it is becoming more and more important every hour, actually. So it will be easier to do it with the Biden administration. Then the issue of intermediate range missiles. Of course, the United States will not return to the INF Treaty, from which they withdrew during the time of the Trump administration. But as I said, Biden administration does not consider arms race as a preferable instrument of confrontation, either vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis Russia. This is why it is unlikely that Biden administration will accelerate the deployment of those intermediate range missiles either in the Pacific or in Europe, and B, it is more likely to agree to some new regime about limitations concerning deployments of those missiles. Then restoration of normal diplomatic and consular relations. The diplomatic and visa war was not initiated by the Biden administration. Biden administration, including people like Tony Blinken, they actually emphasized the necessity of people-to-people contacts, engagement with Russian civil society. From that perspective, the US should be interested in overcoming the current visa stalemate when it is almost impossible now for the Russian citizens to get American visa. That requires restoration of normal diplomatic and consular relations. And last but not least, climate. The issue of climate change will be very important for Biden administration. John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State of the Obama administration, the second Obama administration, will be responsible for the climate change policy of Biden administration. The issue of climate change is of increasing importance for Russia as well. Russia and the United States are Arctic countries in which climate change is 2 times more quicker than in the world, and where the effects of climate change are much more profound and risky. I mean, they are risky everywhere, but in the Arctic, it's much quicker and more visible. So I assume it will be more possible and of course preferable to have a dialogue with the Biden administration on the issues of climate. That actually exhausts a possible positive agenda of US-Russian relations with the Biden administration, because and even implementation of this agenda will be quite difficult, because one of the major features of American domestic situation is division and polarization, which will remain, and polarization in the United States, in high intensity of struggle between Democrats and Republicans, mean that Republicans will continue to use any issues, including foreign policy issues, as instruments against Biden. Actually, as it happened during the time of Obama administration, Republicans played a very important role in undermining the so-called US-Russian reset. So any positive engagement of Biden administration with Russia, including even extension of the New START, will be immediately presented by the Republicans as violation of American interests and values, as a sign of weakness, if not betrayal, on the part of Biden administration. So there will be still political limits, there will be still political risks, but it will be easier to engage. All the rest, right? All the rest will be deterioration of relations. There will be increased criticism of Russia on human rights and democracy. There will be further anti-Russian sanctions. There will be more intensive containment of Russia, political diplomatic containment of Russia in the former USSR, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, in many places of the world. But as I said, despite this more aggravation of relations on those aspects that I have described, it would be there will be more opportunities for Russia and the United States to cooperate.
You have covered a lot of issues, and in fact, my following questions were about the areas of cooperation and confrontation between US and Russia. So you have very comprehensively covered those areas. And I remember that a couple of years ago, you wrote that given the current circumstances, managed confrontation between Russia and the United States is as good as it will get. So what practical steps would you suggest to both the US and the Russian administrations, that what steps they should take to ensure that this relationship is pulled a little back from the brink that it has reached?
Thank you. Let me say a couple of words about the areas of confrontation. Since I was not very detailed on those in my previous response. First, the Biden administration will intensify value rhetoric vis-a-vis Russia and in general, and will increase its criticism of Russia on domestic situation. Will intensify the discourse about the necessity to support the Russian anti-Kremlin opposition, Russian pro-Western liberal NGOs, and so on and so forth. And that will backlash, that will deteriorate the atmosphere of the US-Russian relations even more in comparison with today. Secondly, Biden administration will impose a new set of anti-Russian sanctions. Both in the sanctions related to the Russian domestic affairs. So the usage of Magnitsky Act will be much more robust by the Biden administration than it was the case under Trump administration. In general, the number of targeted sanctions will increase. It is unlikely that Biden administration will conduct a new quality of sanctions and increase the level, the quality of sanctions, bringing it close to, let's say, anti-Iranian sanctions. But the number of targeted sanctions will be increased, and those sanctions will be related to almost anything. Russian performance in Syria, Russian performance in the former USSR, including Ukraine, Russian performance in Libya, in Venezuela, almost everywhere. Then Biden administration will increase synchronization and coordination with Europeans. And that will substantially reduce the freedom of maneuver of Russian foreign policy in terms of engagement with West European countries, and deepening the wedge between the Europeans and the United States. The Atlantic community will become more consolidated under Biden vis-a-vis Russia, and this is bad. However, it must be said at the same time that since one of the major priorities for Biden will be improvement of relations with Germany, it is unlikely that Biden administration will deteriorate and antagonize the Germans even more on the sanctions against Nord Stream 2. So, of course, they will not repeal those sanctions that have already been imposed, but it is unlikely that they will go much further as long as Germany supports Nord Stream 2. But containment of Russia in Europe, in the post-Soviet space, will increase. Biden administration will conduct a very loud rhetoric on the support of Ukraine, and will probably intensify support of Ukraine, on the support of anti-Russian forces in the South Caucasus. They will try to turn Armenia westward, using the current discontent in Armenia about the scale of Russian support of them during the latest war in Nagorno-Karabakh. They will engage more actively the Central Asians, and of course they will be much more active on Belarus, and will increasingly support the Belarusian opposition and claim that all the decisions that Russia is making and has been making with Lukashenko concerning the creation of the Union State is irrelevant and illegal, and the United States would not recognize that. So that will definitely deteriorate relations. Another aspect, by the way, of cooperation, and another area where we could have some opportunities in the Middle East. First, Biden administration is likely, the policies that Biden administration is likely to conduct, they will probably result in deterioration, or at least in some deterioration of the US relations with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey. Right. So if with European countries, West European countries, the United States under Biden will improve relations, with major Middle Eastern allies of the United States, the relations will probably become worse. And that's an opportunity for Russia to play a more essential role in the Middle East. However, Biden administration will try to return to a multilateral approach vis-a-vis Iran, on the nuclear program, and maybe the US and Russia will cooperate with the United States, or at least have a dialogue within this multilateral framework on Iran. Now, what to do, right? And what could Russia do? You are absolutely right. Maximum what Russia can expect and achieve nowadays is management of the US-Russian confrontation, and implementation, at least those several aspects of management of the confrontation, which I described before, prolongation of the New START, avoiding deployments of intermediate range missiles in Europe and in Asia Pacific, the establishment of cybersecurity dialogue, and so on and so forth. So basically, the major purpose nowadays is reducing the risks of arms race, reducing the risks of inadvertent military clash through those measures, ad hoc cooperation where that cooperation can be possible, including multilateral dialogue with Iran, if it becomes possible, elaboration of a new architecture of arms control and sustainment of strategic stability beyond the New START. Maybe it will be multilateral. Maybe it will include China. So we will talk about that with the United States. But actually, the situation, the overall atmosphere in US-Russian relations is so confrontational that the major priority of Russian foreign policy is not relations with the United States, but relations with other partners, taking American factor into account. Right, and that includes post-Soviet space, China, Europe, India, Middle Eastern countries, BRICS in general, and so on and so forth.
When we're talking about major powers, we can hardly not talk about China. And during the presidential debate, President-elect Biden said that China is the top competitor for the United States, but the biggest threat is Russia. So how do you see this view translating into policy on the ground? And how do you think the United States will look at the Russia-China approach, Ma, as its rivalry with China increases?
First, I think there was at least partially a domestic political dimension in that statement of Joe Biden. He said it in order to undermine Trump even more, because accusations of Trump being not as tough vis-a-vis Russia as he probably should have been, it was one of the major accusations, was a part of Biden's campaign against Trump. He accused Trump many times of not reacting to the alleged poisoning of Navalny, not reacting to the alleged, to that scandal concerning Afghanistan when Russia was accused of paying bounties to the Taliban for assassinations of American soldiers, not containing Russia enough in Syria, and allowing Russia and Assad to reestablish more than 90% of control over the Syrian territory, and so on and so forth. Right, so from that perspective, he needed to present Russia as adversary in order to undermine Trump. However, indeed, there will be practical implications of that perception of Russia as an adversary. And for Democrats, Russia is not just a geopolitical adversary, but it is also an ideological adversary whom they accuse of trying to interfere in the United States, to undermine democracies all over the world, especially the Western democracies, and thus strengthen the or ensuring the survival of Russian political regime. But China, they think that the management of China by Trump administration was ineffective. So the practical implications will be the following. As I already said, they will intensify adversarial rhetoric and some adversarial steps, such as sanctions and political containment vis-a-vis Russia. And at the same time, they are likely to take at least a pause in terms of some confrontational instruments vis-a-vis China. One of the major areas of continuity in US foreign policy in general, from Trump to Biden, will be the perception of both China and Russia as adversaries. Right, this reality of great power competition, of great power rivalry, will not disappear, right? Of course, the Biden administration will continue the policy of dual simultaneous confrontation with China and Russia at the same time, right? They will not return to the pre-Trump policy that Obama conducted with a mixture of containment and engagement of China. Now, there will be engagement will be very limited, and the major aspect will be still containment of China by the United States. However, there will be a different use of instruments. They will put less emphasis on arms race. And if the plans of deployment of American intermediate range missiles in the Pacific existed in the time of the Trump administration, they will probably be revised by the Biden administration. They will make a pause in a trade war. It doesn't mean end of the trade war, but a pause of trade war. And three, they will engage China on climate change. Right, because it is impossible to conduct a more or less effective policy of struggling against climate change without China. Right. On the other aspects of containing China, Biden administration will show continuity. Technological containment, sanctions and limitations against the Chinese technological companies, struggling against Chinese trade policies. By the way, American trade policies under Biden are supposed to be mercantilist, no return to the free trade policies of pre-Trump administrations. Multilateral approach, Biden administration will be even more robust in terms of engaging allies and partners in containing China, both Asian allies and partners and European allies and partners. From that perspective, the policy of containment of China under Biden administration can be even more difficult for the Chinese, right? Because, for the Europeans, since Biden administration will improve relations with the Europeans, it will be more difficult for the West European countries to resist American pressure on them to join the United States in containing China. In terms of Quad, the quadrennial partnership, Biden administration will probably continue the policy of the Trump administration. struggling against one belt, one road. They will continue the policy of the Trump administration. The rhetoric on Indo-Pacific and the concept of Indo-Pacific is likely to also to be remained by the Biden administrations, but they will try to make relations with China, more manageable. Rhetorically, they will declare a pause, a reconsideration. They will certainly make a pause on certain policies. But look, strategically, fundamentally, it will be still an adversarial, confrontational policy of containment. Whereas on Russia, as I already said, right, rhetorically they will declare deterioration, even stronger pressure on Russia, not a pause, but increase of pressure on Russia. But at the same time, there could be some tangible positive results on certain aspects of US-Russian relations in order to make them more manageable. So both relations with Russia are likely to remain confrontational but become more manageable, and relations with China are also likely to remain confrontational and more manageable under Biden administration.
Okay, I do know that we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you a quick last question. So if you were asked to suggest to the policymakers, because you've listed several causes of confrontation, you see the US-Russia relations not really improving at a very rapid pace. We're not expecting some radical change to come over. But if you had to suggest to the policymakers something that should fundamentally change in the US-Russia relations to ensure that we can sort of bring about a change towards the positive. So what would that suggestion be?
Well, the change of US-Russia, fundamental change of US-Russian relations to the positive, is not likely in the next several years. It is not likely before the second half of this decade. It will be possible only on several conditions. First, polarization inside the United States needs to be overcome. As long as American society and political system remains so internally confrontational, so polarized and divided, it is very difficult to talk about any improvement of relations with an unfriendly country. And of course, Russia will not become a friend and partner of the United States, right? Because improvement of relations, because any sort of détente even requires a strong bipartisan coalition. This is impossible provided internal polarization of the United States. Secondly, improvement of relations with Russia requires a fundamental change of the very paradigm of the US foreign policy. Today, the paradigm is defeating Russia and China as independent great powers that refuse to join the US-led international order. Right, confrontation against them until they fail in their current developmental models and their current foreign policies, and return basically to the 1990s. At least with Russia, where a return to this paradigm of integration into the US-led international order. Of course, I understand that it is difficult for the United States to accept the realities of multipolarity. It is difficult for the United States to construct joint international order with non-Western players because the US completely lacks such historical experience, and it is against the American ideology, American global leadership, and so on and so forth. But it is impossible for the United States to turn the course of history back. Right, the US need to adjust to multipolarity, and not in a confrontational way, not in terms of containment of independent poles, but in a positive way, in terms of the mutual creation of international order. I mean, it will be very difficult for the US to adapt to such situation, but only after and as a result of this adaptation, US-Russian relations could improve. The third option could be the collapse of Russia, right? If Russia completely collapses as a country, as a great power, and kind of repeats the experience of late 1980s, early 1990s, then of course the US-Russian relations will temporarily improve. But I do not consider that scenario quite realistic. So what should be done to improvement of US-Russian relations? First, now managing the confrontation. That's maximum what is achievable now. In the longer term prospect, what Russia should do, do not exacerbate American internal divisions, right? Strategically, Russia is interested in reconsolidation of American political system and society, not in divisions, because only new consensus could bring this bipartisan coalition about improvement relations with Russia. B, establish partnerships beyond the United States with allies and partners of the United States, with other great powers. Russia should focus and intensify even more its partnership with India, with Southeast Asian countries, with Brazil, with Japan, with China, right? But of course, Russia should preserve its partnership with China, but it should balance its partnership with China with deepening of partnerships with other players. As I said already, Europeans, establishing or deepening, intensifying strong dialogue with the Europeans. It is difficult now. The current conjuncture is not favorable for that, especially in the context of election of Joe Biden and in the context of the alleged poisoning of Navalny and the negative repercussions of that for Russian-European relations. But if Russia established strong networks of partnerships with other players, with other poles, and even allies and partners of the United States, it will accelerate the US adjustment to the realities of multipolarity. The US will increasingly be coming to conclusion that their policy of containment doesn't work, that their policy of mutual simultaneous containment of Russia and China doesn't work. Of course, Russia also should strengthen and preserve its partnership with China, because one of the reasons why the US continue this policy of simultaneous confrontation and contradicts to the conventional wisdom of Henry Kissinger, right? That relations between the US and China and US and Russia should be better than the Russian-Chinese relations. So why do they contradict to that wisdom? Because the American mainstream, political mainstream, believes that sooner or later Russia will start regarding China as a threat and will kind of crawl back on its knees to the Western orbit, asking for protection from China. Well, we need to prove the United States that this is not the case, and that the Russian-Chinese relations will not deteriorate in the future. But it is very dangerous for Russia to limit itself with just strengthening Russian-Chinese partnership. We need to build stronger balances, stronger partnerships with other Asian players, first and foremost India, European players, and Middle Eastern players, and so on and so forth. Only this network of partnerships around Russia will ultimately compel the United States to revise their confrontational strategy.
Dr. Dmitri Suslov, thank you so much for joining us and sharing such a detailed analysis of the US-Russia relationship. And we hope that we will get to talk to you soon again as the new administration further unveils its policies after their formal inauguration. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you very much. It was big pleasure for me.
Thank you.